Hey guys, Whitney here. Welcome to the Passive Investing Made Simple show. I'm your host, Whitney Elkins-Hutten, Director of Investor Education here at PassiveInvesting.com. And I'm so excited to have a very special guest on today. But before we get into who our guest is, and if you're here live, you know exactly who it is. I just want to make sure that you are aware that you can get access to future master classes like this, access to our skills boot camps, and access to our deals at passiveinvestingwithwhitney.com. So make sure to go there. If you want more information on how to go into your first or next deal, passive deal with confidence, go to passiveinvestingwithwhitney.com. Now, I want to leave plenty of time for today's show. So without further ado, our guest, Tom Wheelwright, author of Tax-Free Wealth. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Whitney. Really good to be with you and everybody else that's listening and watching.
Excellent. Well, Tom, like I said, we were talking a little bit beforehand in the green room. I have read two versions of Tax-Free Wealth. If there's a third version out, I need to go get it. Super fangirl of all of your work. Also the Wealth Ability Show. So I am super excited to have you on today. We're going to keep today's conversation initially contained to depreciation and how this all works. But before we launch into that, Tom, can you share a little bit about your background and how you became interested in tax planning and wealth building?
Well, I go way back for that. My first tax class I took in 1983. This is my first tax class, and I have an undergraduate in accounting from the University of Utah, and that's actually, I'm sorry, 1979 was my first tax class. Let's be really clear, 1979. So it's been over 45 years since I've been in the tax business. I went to the University of Texas to do my graduate degree in tax, and then I spent 3 years in the national office of Ernst & Young, doing tax work and actually tax training for CPAs all over the country for Ernst & Young. And then I spent 14 years as a professor at Arizona State University as an adjunct professor in their Masters of Tax program. And last 30 years, I've been running CPA firms, and right now running a franchise of CPA and tax advisory firms.
Well, I'm going to assume that you like tax planning.
Pretty good assumption, since taxes are my life. I am a self-avowed tax nerd, so I do love taxes. Taxes are my life.
Well, I have to kind of Google at that, because a lot of people that start off as passive investors in real estate, really they are attracted to this type of investing in real estate because they don't want to learn all the ins and outs about tax planning. They don't want to be the one operating the deal. They have a higher and better use with their time in their day job or running their business or just being in charge of their family. And so they look to engage in experts that know all this. But as you and I both know, at some point in time, when you scale as an investor, tax planning does become incredibly important.
Yeah, one of the challenges is that I can't actually reduce your taxes. What I can do is I can tell you what you need to do to reduce your taxes. So it does need to be a partnership between the tax advisor and the investor.
And I think that's beautifully said, for sure. Well, let's talk about one of the more powerful strategies or ways to reduce your tax liability. And I've read your book, Tax-Free Wealth. But that is taking advantage of business deductions. And one of those best business deductions that you get from real estate, whether you own your own single family properties, run your own multifamily projects, or even as a passive real estate investor, is depreciation. So can you explain the concept of depreciation in passive real estate investing and why it's important for a passive investor to understand?
Yeah, depreciation is one of the few deductions where you get a deduction even though the money that you invested is increasing. So you get a deduction for something that's increasing in value. That does not happen really in any other place. So for example, take oil and gas. You get a deduction in oil and gas, but because you're taking the product out of the ground, you're selling the product. But for real estate, you're actually letting people use the product and you're getting the deduction for their use of your product, even though it's tends to continually go up in value. So depreciation is kind of magic. That's chapter 7 of Tax-Free Wealth is the magic of depreciation. And I first described that actually with Robert Kiyosaki 20 years ago on stage with him, and explained to him that it was is a little bit of magic. So depreciation is basically, technically it's for the wear and tear on your property. And so you don't get depreciation on land because that has no wear and tear. It doesn't wear out. You do get a little bit on the building because the tax law says that a residential building will wear out in about 27.5 years, and a commercial building about 39 years. So you get a very slow depreciation for that because it's going down slowly. But there are 2 other aspects of what you buy besides the land and the building. And this is where a lot of investors and frankly, a lot of tax advisors make a mistake, because they think all you bought is land and building. Well, no, you bought the land improvements, including the landscaping. And for some of us, like my wife, landscaping lasts longer than for those of us like me that have a brown thumb, and it doesn't last very long at all. But landscaping is an improvement, and it does get special depreciation rates, and they're faster than the building is. So it's basically 15 years. And then when you have inside the building, you have carpet, you have window coverings, you have ceiling fans. Where I am, everybody has a ceiling fan in every room in your house because I'm in Arizona. And but the reality is that there's lots of contents in a building. Typically, we find about 20% of a purchase price is really the contents of the project, of the building itself, and it's not the building. And so what happens is those get depreciated over 5 years. And of course, as you know, since 2017, we get a supercharged deduction called bonus depreciation, which means that of the land improvements and the contents, we don't just get it over 15 years or 5 years, we actually get this year, 2024, we get 60% of it in the first year, and then we take the rest over 15 years and 5 years.
Yeah, and so thank you for elaborating on that concept between bonus depreciation and how it differs from regular depreciation. I think there's the accounting methodology here. How do we get from depreciation to that more accelerated schedule? Because it's not an automatic given. Like, how does an investor get to that, or an operator get to that accelerated?
Well, there's actually some intricacies to that. Because first of all, it is automatic. And if it's not automatic, then that means your tax advisor or your CPA is not doing it right. It should be automatic. But here's what happens. The first thing you have to do is you have to hire somebody to do what's called a cost segregation. And a cost segregation is simply the engineering project of breaking down the costs between the land, the building, the improvements, and the contents. That's an engineering job. And so cost segregation people are engineers, and then they have to have a CPA with them to actually break it down from a tax standpoint, but they break it down from a cost standpoint. So step number 1 is you have to do a cost segregation, and rule number 1 is you need to do a cost segregation on every property. That's really rule number 1. Once you've done the cost segregation, it's actually pretty simple, because then it's really just applying the last year it was 80%, this year it's 60%, next year it's 40%, and then it's just applying the depreciation rates after that. It's pretty simple once you do the cost segregation. That's the piece that people miss.
Well, and just to let people know, especially the people that, most listeners of the show who are passive investors, that is something that the operator will handle for you, is that cost segregation. That even that cost segregation isn't an automatic given. When you're talking to an operator, make sure that you're asking, hey, when you purchase a property, when you close on it, are you doing a cost segregation?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I had a conversation with somebody I know quite well a few years ago, and I asked, because they were promoting an investment, I said, are you doing the cost segregation? They said, no, we're not going to. Our investors like us whether we do a cost segregation or not. I'm going, well, that's an interesting perspective. So I'm going, okay, well, I just need to know, because a lot of their investors actually were clients of mine. And so I had to let my clients know, you're not going to get a cost segregation if you invest in this project. That's a pretty big deal, because let me give you an example. On a, if you were to invest $100,000 and the project is an 80% loan to value, okay? So that means that the project, there's $400,000 of debt on it, right? So think of a single family home, but even in the good days, even large rental properties got an 80% loan to value. So on $500,000, if 30% of that $500,000 belongs to improvements and contents, and you get a deduction for 60% of that if you do a cost segregation, then that means that's a $90,000 deduction the first year if you do a cost segregation on a $100,000 investment. That's 90% of your investment you get to deduct. If you don't do a cost segregation, then you will get roughly 3.5% of the total number. So you get roughly, it actually turns out to be roughly 3% of the 500,000. So instead of a $90,000 deduction, you would get a $15,000 deduction, 3% of $500,000. So that's a pretty big difference. And one of the challenges that people have, and for some reason there are lots of tax preparers who have the same challenge, is that they say, well, if you're passive, you don't get to take that deduction. That is, and that's because of the passive loss rules. And we can go into that if you'd like a little bit. But the reality is that if your tax advisor or tax preparer is telling that you're not going to get it, you probably need a new tax advisor, and which is actually why we started our franchise last year, is because we just had so much demand for people who actually knew what they were doing, CPAs who actually knew what they were doing, that we had to open up we actually had to start a franchise for it.
Mm-hmm. Now, okay, so I think we stopped just short of connecting the dots for the investor. So in one case, I do a cost segregation, or I invest in a project that does a cost segregation. I invested $100,000, I get $90,000 loss on my K1 in year one. And versus investing with another operator who doesn't do a cost segregation, and I only get $15,000 loss on my K1. Okay, I understand the difference between 90K and 100K or 15K loss, but from a wealth building perspective, connect the dots for our investors here.
Well, so that's a $90,000 deduction. So let's say you're in a 33% tax bracket, federal and state, okay? That means that that's $30,000 in your pocket immediately. That's $30,000 you could invest somewhere else. So, you know, the key to real estate, people think real estate's all about real estate, but it's not. Real estate's really all about debt and taxes. Because without debt, real estate is a pretty mediocre investment. In fact, I have fights, knockdown, drag out fights with my financial planner friends who constantly tell me, well, but the stock market goes up more than real estate. And the answer is pre-tax and pre-debt. That is correct. But you add debt, you've just multiplied your investment. Typically, here's the rule of thumb. If you can double your investment in the stock market, typically, let's say over 10 years, 7% over 10 years, you double your investment. If you add debt, you should cut that in half. So you should actually quadruple your investment over the same 10 years. So instead of 2 + 2 = 4, 2 + 2 = 8. If you get the tax benefits right, then all of a sudden 2 + 2 = 16. So the question is, which is better, 4 or 16? And that's really what it comes down to, because the amount of the return on investment goes up because of the debt, right? Your return on investment, because you've got the spread between your cap rate, basically, and the interest rate. So if you're, let's say if you were at 80% loan to value, then that means, and you had an 8% cap rate, that's 8% if you paid cash for it. Okay, 8% you paid cash for it, and you have a 6% interest rate. Okay, well, at 80% loan to value, because that's 4 times your equity, right? That's a debt to equity ratio of 4. 4 times that difference between 8 and 6 is 2, and 4 times 2 is 8. Well, 8 plus 8, 16. So now you're at double your rate of return. What taxes do is they reduce the amount of the investment. So if on that same $100,000 that you put in, I will tell you, a year ago, we could, if you were in a 42% tax bracket, your tax benefit added up to $50,000 the first year, which means you didn't really put in $100,000. It meant the government put in 50 and you put in 50. Well, now if you put in 50,000 and get a 16% return, that's really a 32% return, because it's 16% on 50, not 16% on 100. Okay, and I know we're doing math, but I know you're recording this, so hopefully people are able to listen to this over and over again. It's also in Chapter 7 of Tax-Free Wealth. Just know that. So there's places to go for this. But my point is that taxes are, you know, if you look at, you can go from 4 to 8 with the debt, but you go from 8 to 16 with the tax. So if you look at what's the most important aspect here, it's not the real estate, it's not the debt, it's the taxes. They're actually the single most important aspect of real estate investing, is to get the taxes right. So if you're not getting the taxes right, you're literally losing half of your investment.
And like I said, you know, that's dollars back in your pocket that you can then reinvest and create velocity with your money and your wealth building. So powerful.
So consider that if you get $50,000 back, you can't just invest in $500,000 project. You can invest in $1 million project, because you know you're going to get the money back from the government. So that means that right up front, you can actually invest in, because you have $100,000, you just don't pay it into the government. So now you've got an extra $100,000. So now you can actually invest $200,000, not $100,000, because $100,000 is not going to the government. $100,000 is your money, and between you, then you can invest in $1 million, and you've literally doubled the amount of real estate you can invest in.
Okay, I want to flip this on its head a little bit, right? Because I'm right in there with you. I am total real estate investor. You know, I don't want to say active. I'm not flipping or anything like that. I hold my own controlled real estate. I have a, you know, pretty significant passive portfolio. But what happens? Because and when I talk to investors all the time, they were like, okay, that's nice that I get the tax benefit, but what happens when the asset sells? Okay, don't I owe all of that back to the government?
You don't. This is the magic of it. You don't, because first of all, if you think about it, what goes up in value? Well, the contents aren't going up in value. They really are going down in value, right? And the land improvements don't go up in value. They are also going down in value. So when you sell the project for a gain, you're really, what you're getting, what the gain is the gains on on the building and the land. Well, that's all capital gain. So let's say that you're in that 33% tax bracket, but for capital gains purposes, you're in a 15% tax bracket. All right, so now I've got half the tax that I'm paying on my gain when I sell it, even though I got the full 33% tax benefit. So I'm getting a 33% tax benefit and paying back at 15%. So that right there is a good deal, because that's free money and you never have to pay it back. But it can get better, because, you know, we have 1031 exchanges, like kind of exchanges. So you can do this. I coined the phrase in Tax-Free Wealth 2012, that you can do what we call the buy, borrow, die strategy. So you buy real estate, you reinvest it. If you need money, you borrow from it. You reinvest it again. Those are 1031 exchanges. When you die, that tax goes away completely. It becomes permanent. So you can do this, and you can do it with different types of real estate. So you might start out with single family homes, and then you might want to go to apartment buildings. And then you're getting to be my age, and you go, hey, I don't want to deal with tenants. I don't want to deal with that stuff. So I'm going to go get a triple net lease. I'm going to go buy a Walgreens. Okay, Walgreens are all triple net leases. Or I'm going to go buy a Walmart or Safeway or whatever. These are all triple net leases. Wendy's, all triple net leases. They don't own their own real estate. So you go and you say, I'm going to trade my apartment building for a Walgreens. You can do that. And now I just got passive income coming in. I call it mailbox money. When I die, all that depreciation, all that potential recapture that they talk about completely goes away under the tax law.
Well, I also want to throw one other strategy in here is that if you decide to sell your apartment building, and I'd like to get your input on this, because this is something we do with our investors, is that we allow them to go into a tenant in common placement
right.
with a truly passive investment. So they're not even buying another building, right? Like what is your thought on that?
Yeah, so a tenancy in common, and a lot of people do that through a Delaware statutory trust, which is basically a tenancy in common with a master agreement. And basically what you're doing is you're allowing on the tenancy in common, you're allowing people to make a choice. Some people want cash and some people will want to do a 1031. And I think it's a great idea. I love it. I love the Delaware statutory trust because they make it so easy. Tenancy in commons otherwise are a little difficult if you don't have some type of a master agreement like that, like a Delaware statutory trust gives you. And then you get to choose. Yeah, I think it's a terrific idea. And you get into an investment that you don't have to deal with, but it just has to stay in investment real estate. It doesn't matter what kind, as long as it's in the US.
Okay, so that brings up another question, and something that I wasn't planning on asking you. Somebody goes to sell their business, right?
Yeah.
Their business is appreciated, and they want to move into real estate and just kind of right off into the sunset. I know, what was it, in 1924, the 1031 exchange between business and real estate disappeared, right? How does that work? Like, is there an option for somebody to sell their business and then do some sort of transfer into real estate?
Oh, there's so many things you can do. So the good news is you sell your business, probably you're going to be in a capital gains tax bracket. When you buy real estate, let's say it sold your business for $1 million. It's just a little business. You sold it for $1 million, and you put that $1 million into real estate. Okay, and you put it, and again, you have to have debt along with the taxes, right? So let's say you've got your 80% loan to value. So you put $1 million and you get $5 million of real estate. Well, the depreciation tax benefits from the real estate will largely offset the capital gain from the business. So you can still do it. You're just gonna, on one hand, you've got a taxable event, the other hand, you've got a deduction. And deductions and within business properties like that, business and real estate, one deduction offsets the other income. And so you still end up pretty close to zero with any tax. I mean, there's lots of even more sophisticated planning that we do with our clients, but probably too much for the show.
Now, is there, from a timing perspective, does that all have to happen in the same calendar year for it to run smoothly?
It does, because you're going to think that's a really, really astute question, because you're going to recognize the gain in the year you sell the business. Okay, and so you need to get the loss in the same year. You've got to match it up. Now, one thing you can do is a lot of businesses sell over a period of time. They might sell over 3 years. Well, that's called an installment sale. And an installment sale, you don't pick up the gain until you actually get the money. So that means that you might be able to invest in 3 different projects over those 3 years. You just have to time the gain with the deduction. It's that simple.
Okay, so I'm glad to know that I was somewhat on the right track on that. Well, Tom, for passive investors that are eyeing, the passive losses as a strategy for building wealth, what are some key considerations they should keep in mind from a tax optimization standpoint?
Well, number one is recognize that passive losses if they're truly passive, can only offset passive income. And that means that you have two choices. You have to change your passive loss to an active loss, and we can talk about how to do that, or you have to change your active income into passive income, which that is something nobody talks about. I actually have never heard anybody but me talk about that, which is bizarre because it's the most obvious thing in the world. If passive losses can only offset passive income, well, one of my clear alternatives is get passive income, right? And that, if you're a business owner, that is really easy. I mean, that's something we do all day long, convert business income into passive income. But the other way to do it, of course, is if you're a passive investor, but at the same time, most of the time that you spend, you don't have another job, or your spouse doesn't have another job, and they spend a lot of time at real estate, generating these passive investments and managing the passive investments, then you can actually become a real estate professional. And that's a simple test. It's more than 750 hours in a year doing real estate and more time in real estate than your other jobs. So it just has to be your primary business. That's basically what it has to be, is real estate as your primary income earning activity. Okay, let's put it that way. And if you do that, then your rental real estate is now that those losses become active losses, and active losses can offset any business income and up to about $600,000 of other income.
Now, I know the kind of the way I grew up in real estate, so to speak. I started off in living, flipping, house hacking, single family homes, then, did the traditional, let's go buy a multi-family building. I was very much trying to chase the rep status, the real estate professional status. Now, most people here that are listening to the show, they have their day job and they're trying to figure out how to be that passive investor. Is there a path for somebody who wants to be just a passive investor to actually tap into the rep status?
There is. I've actually never been a real estate professional, and I always get my real estate deductions. So there absolutely is. If you own a business. So if you're a W-2 employee and you have passive real estate, then you're not going to get that upfront deduction. Now, it's still worthwhile, by the way, because you're still trading a 33% deduction for 15% income or 20% income. So it's still a good trade, and it's still a good deal. You just won't get that money up front. You won't get the money until the project sells. That's when you get the money. Because what happens is when you sell the project, it frees up those passive losses and they get to be deducted against your ordinary income. So you get that 33% tax deduction in the year you sell, but you pick up the gain at capital gains rates, half of the amount of your ordinary income, ordinary deduction rate. So it's still a good deal. Okay, so that's a misunderstanding that I hear a lot of people talk about. Well, you're never going to get the passive losses because you're a passive investor and you're not going to be real estate, and you're a W-2. Let's say you're a physician and you make a lot of money as a W-2, but it's just not going to work. And you don't have a business. And if that's the case, then yeah, you're not going to get as big a benefit. You'll get that spread between your capital gains and your ordinary income, but you won't get the immediate benefit. So it's really just a timing issue on passive versus active. It's just timing. The total benefit is the same.
Well, Tom, I want to switch to the book a little bit because we've been talking a lot about depreciation and how to maximize that, not tax optimization so much, but how do we tap into that to keep income tax free, to create velocity with our money in our wealth building. But I know there's a few other strategies, outlined in the book, tax-free wealth. What are the top couple that a passive investor should be aware of?
Oh, first of all, remember that what we're doing is really what the government is asking us to do. What the government's saying is, if you invest this way, we'll give you this tax benefit. If you decide to invest another way, you don't get the tax benefit. And that's all they're doing. They're trying to direct the economy. So if you invest in the stock market, the only way to get a deduction for investing in the stock market is your 401k. That's it. And you're maxed out, right? You're maxed out somewhere in the $50,000 range, typically. So that's it. That's all you can do. But in real estate, there's no max. In business, there's no max. In energy, there's no max. In agriculture, there's no max. So you just have to look at what is it the government wants me to do, and that's actually one of the rules, is that whatever the government wants you to do, that's where you're going to see the tax benefits. There are, I go through a lot of tricks and tips in tax-free wealth. I mean, one of them's, and I actually get these thrown back at me all the time. I had a client, you'll love this, Whitney. I had a client the other day, had been to a seminar. I mean, this is a client of mine, my personal client, good friend of mine. Has read tax-free wealth a number of times and came to me and said, well, I heard about this great idea. It's the Augusta rule. I'm going, okay, so that is in tax-free wealth. You need to reread tax-free wealth. You didn't need to go to a seminar to get that. It should be your Bible for tax purposes, is tax-free wealth, because the Augusta rule is a pretty cool rule. It's called the Augusta rule because of the Masters golf tournament in Augusta, Georgia. And basically what it says is, if you rent your personal house out for 14 days or less, you don't have to pick up income on the rent. You don't have to pick the rent up as income. Well, I'll give you an example of that. So last year we had the Super Bowl in Phoenix, and Rihanna was the halftime show. And Rihanna rented a house in Paradise Valley for $800,000 for 10 days, $80,000 a day. The person who rented that home to her did not have to pick any of that $800,000 up in income. It was tax-free. So not all of us get to rent our homes to Rihanna, but the reality is you can certainly, every city has one of those events where it's really a week to 2 week event. And you can rent out your house, go on vacation. The rent will pay for your vacation. Let them use your house, just Airbnb it for 2 weeks, and or VRB or whatever, however you want to do it, and just rent it out for 2 weeks, and you won't have to pay tax on the income. It's a pretty sweet deal. Was invented. It was put in the tax law long before Airbnb was invented. So it's way easier to do now than it was when it was first put in the law. But it's a pretty sweet deal. You can actually, if you don't want to rent it out to somebody else, you can rent it to your business and do business and use it for your own business, and you get the same tax benefit. So that's a pretty sweet deal. I will tell you, anything that produces income for your business is probably deductible. So any expense you have that produces income is probably deductible. There are a few exceptions. Entertainment, it's not deductible. But for the most part, if you're spending the money to make money, the government's going to allow you to deduct it. And that's pretty cool, because that means you've got a home office. That could mean your car. For real estate people, that car's a big deal. For business owners, it's a big deal. If you have a home office, it's a big deal. These things all add up, and they actually add up to a significant amount of money. And people leave a lot of money on the table. And I for the life of me, I don't understand why.
Well, Tom, I think this is a great place for us to wrap up our at least live part of the session and transition to the Ask Me Anything part of the session. And if you're here live, make sure to go to the Q&A box, enter your question. I will facilitate those questions with Tom. But before we wrap up this part of the show, Tom, how does somebody find a great accountant in order to help them navigate?
Well, thank you for that. That is the hardest thing. And one of the challenges is that there are a lot of people out there promoting themselves as tax advisors that are enrolled agents. And enrolled agents are really good if you have a really simple situation. But if you're a serious investor, or you have complex issues, like I want to get my passive losses, you need a CPA. And so that would be my rule number one for a tax advisor. I would strongly recommend a CPA. I'll give you an easy button. Go to wealthability.com and have a consultation. We have franchisees all over the country, and I train them. I've got a call with them this evening, and I train them all the time. And these people are amazing. They're amazing tax advisors. So that's the easy way to do it.
Awesome. Well, Tom, thank you so much for being on our show here today.